as I was introduced, I'm from the University of Manchester. I work in the library there. The library is currently, as is common across the sector, in kind of a spasm of change. We are working very, very hard to make sure that what we deliver suits our students, suits the staff, and is also within the resource and capabilities of what we have. And with that in mind, around 18 months ago, maybe just over 2 years, we started looking at specifically the capacity, comfort level, and capability with regards to digital in our staff. It was part of a larger project, or it is part of a larger project called Digital First, whose general purpose was to look really closely at our process and our pedagogies and our sort of first instincts and ask, are we doing this the right way? With a specific perspective in, is there a way we could do this digitally? Now, I'd like to emphasize that digitally doesn't mean could we use Microsoft Access. Digitally didn't mean why aren't we using Excel. Digitally for us really actually meant, is there a way to kind of make a frictionless conversation happen, okay, that we can record, evaluate, and kind of continue and keep going on. I don't know how long all of you have worked in HE or how many of you work in libraries, but it won't come to any surprise for anyone working in any larger organization that there's obviously a range of people's use of digital. We still have members of staff who use a paper diary, which is problematic if they or the diary is absent and anyone needs to know where they are. We have staff who refuse to print anything out and have gone totally paperless, and we have everything in between. And actually this work around digital skills was not about changing anybody, okay? It was about sort of revealing what is possible and allowing us to be our best selves. And the easiest way I can emphasize that is by saying, I still handwrite all my presentations. I put them on slides because obviously you need to see it, and that's the easiest way to disseminate. But for me, the physical act of writing them down is what makes them crystallize. So we're not asking people to change. We're not judging them, as was so well highlighted by our keynote, for what they do or do not do, or how they feel or do not feel. We're just showing people what's possible and enabling them to take advantage. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd like you to spend the time I'm talking thinking about what it would mean in terms of continuing professional development, because it's easier to maybe get a checklist, assign a course, do an induction program, and kind of write it off as done. But we were quite ambitious with this, and we decided from the very off that this wasn't about a one-off set of events where we would suddenly upskill everyone to a level that had been decided in some kind of darkened committee room and then write it off as done. This is about creating a flexible process and pedagogical sort of group or program that enabled us to continue developing ourselves professionally within our work. So as it may, I'll talk you through sort of what we've done so far and where we think we're going next. So in terms of the context, so institutionally this is extremely strategic, for lack of a better word, for the library. There are a lot of things we need to do, and many of them involve things that are now digital. There are a lot of processes that we still do that are like remnants of things that we did because we didn't have digital, okay? So there are so many things you assume have to happen because they always have happened. So what we really wanted to do was take apart not just our sort of where we could add something digitally or where we could use a computer program instead of a manual program or something. We want to take apart the very process and see, can we just do it differently? So it was very strategic. Now on one level, okay, and we have to be very honest about this, some of it's about being efficient, right? Oftentimes a digital solution is a more efficient one. Some of it's about recognizing that our workforce has changed significantly, and where we might have had 10, 12 people on a desk to answer individual queries, we now have one. Or if we have one, you know, they may not be there, they may not be assigned owing to that library, they may not have the depth of understanding, you know, that was previously something we could assume. So it's strategic, okay, in a number of different ways. So one of them was because we wanted to take everything apart and think about strategically about what we were doing. And another one is because we're recognizing the realities of where we are now and how we have to answer those realities. Another thing that was going on was that there were a lot of demands on library staff right now, and also demands that on development. So we have a really robust training sort of budget. We have a lot of people generally can get the training that they need to do their role, but previously this training took the place of, okay, find a course, do the course, now you know the thing. Okay, so it was very inflexible. It was quite dependent on external things happening elsewhere. It didn't really necessarily address the idea that once someone got back, what do they do with what they learned? In fact, have you learned anything if you don't do anything with it? And it was very difficult to sustain, because obviously what happens then is if someone changes roles or moves on, you again have a skills gap. Okay? So we're trying to address something by creating a flexible program that didn't look at one-off learning opportunities as the solution for actually most of what we were looking for. Another thing that we wanted to do was allow for agency. Okay? So the flexibility that's inherent in what we've developed, that I'll talk you through, is really focused on members of staff taking responsibility for what it is they need to learn, where they feel they are, and where they feel they should go. It doesn't mean they take this responsibility in some kind of darkened vacuum, airless room where they're doing it without any kind of input from their managers or from other peers. But the responsibility here is actually on the member of staff. Okay? That also means if we're giving people agency and responsibility, then it's our responsibility to provide a program they can take advantage of. Okay? So it is one thing to say it's now up to you. Okay, you find the thing, you develop where you need to develop. Something else entirely to say, okay, you do that, but we're not helping. So we felt like that this digital skills program was going to be in response to that. It would be flexible. There would be multiple ways of entry. Okay, a load of different ways to sort of respond and reflect, and different ways to evaluate and look at impact and assess what was going on. Okay, so it was about agency as well. Another thing that was going on was that it needed to be scalable. So there we have not a lot of change. In fact, I think a couple of years ago I heard we were about 3% turnover in staff, which is as close to zero as you're going to get these days. So we don't see a lot of sort of staff in and out. But what we do see is a lot of people moving around the library, whether it's because we have sort of short-term flexible contracts that have to do with specific projects, or people are moving up or around depending on their interests and their progression or whatever it is. So we had to make sure it was scalable in such a way, as I touched on before, that we weren't constantly having to redo the same face-to-face training every time someone new needed it, or in fact, any time you had someone who came in. There had to be a way to take what we learned and make it available to a wider and wider and wider audience, even if that first thing that happened was face-to-face, was bespoke, was external. It had to be something we could take and iterate out or disseminate out. Okay, so it needed to be scalable. Another thing that needed to go on was that it had to scale with the content. I have no idea what digital capabilities is going to mean in 5 years. Not a clue. I don't know what it's going to mean to specific members of staff today. Okay? We have to have a program that can also scale inside of itself. So we can, if we need to, currently, which is true in some cases, focus on understanding social media. Okay? Because there's a lot of push right now to have people in a work persona on Twitter, things like that. We need people to understand that. In 5 years, someone could have bought Twitter. Okay? They could have themselves interfered more heavily in a different election and maybe aren't the place to be. Whatever it is, we don't know. So the program itself has to be able to respond reasonably quickly, okay, to changes in drivers and content, and in fact, from the ground up, in what staff are asking for. Okay? So it needs to be flexible and scalable in terms of content as well. And then finally, it has to scale with the impact of what we've discovered. So if someone somewhere hits on the perfect thing, we have to be able to get it out to everyone. Okay? It's quite unfair to say, oh yes, well, someone's done that, it was quite expensive, that's it, they're the only person who gets access to it. Or someone's done that, it's because it's their role and in the hierarchy it makes sense to send them, and that's it. That's sort of only for them. I feel quite strongly that learning is for everyone, and that if you go out and you learn something, part of learning is going back and teaching it to others. It not only helps the others, but it will help you. So it needs to be a system that enabled that to happen. Okay? So there was a lot going on here. And I have to say, Andy Land, who's on our leadership team at the library, Lorraine Beard, and Jan herself, who's the director of our library, were amazingly supportive and helpful when, instead of coming in and being like, I think we could baseline this way, and then we'll address the issues and the gaps here, and then we'll be all done, I came and was like, I think we should just completely redo staff development. They went, okay, let's see what you can do. So they were really quite supportive of us doing this. So what we did after that was we launched a small pilot. There were about 45 people to 60 people, depending on what was going on involved. And the first thing we did was argue about baselining. I really didn't want to. I didn't see the point. One person's here at one point. I don't know if you were following on Twitter earlier, but I said obviously in physics we acknowledge that you can't understand where something is and when it is simultaneously. So I don't know why you could do that with learning. Okay, I don't know why we assume we can figure those exact coordinates out while we're learning as well. But there is still a driver. People want to understand on a workforce level what we're capable of. So what we've decided to do, okay, and we tried it out within the pilot, was give that agency back and try and make a holistic self-assessment, okay, a holistic self-assessment of where you are now. So one of the reasons that I thought this was important was because this was meant to apply for everyone in our library, from people who were there to shelve on an hourly basis a couple times a week, all the way through to leadership team who are expected to go out and present, or to our digital technology people who are expected to obviously know all things digital. Okay? So we thought that one of the first steps they had to take was people had to sit down and be given the time to think about where they were and whether they were doing what they could do and what they needed to do what they wanted to do. So there was a self-assessment bit. We also started arguing quite fiercely that there needed to be a tie-in to personal development. We have these forms, I'm sure everyone has these forms, where we write down the goals and the training we want, and they never really tied up into a bow or into like something that the library acted on as a group. So we also said, regardless of the individual requesting the training, we wanted some kind of baseline understanding of the training being requested. Because I don't want to tell you what you need, but if you're telling me what you need, and there are a load of people saying it, we're going to get it for you. Okay? So first we ask them to assess themselves, then we look at the library as a whole. So we're never targeting individuals. And then finally we're building in a session or an expectation that you speak with your manager about your development. Okay? So we're trying to triangulate it three ways. How do you feel? What do you say without you being involved in it? Okay, so what do you say almost anonymously? And then finally, in conversation with others, what else comes out? And we would assume the conversation is where you discuss things like strategic drivers or maybe what else you'd need. So for that pilot, we started looking at that, and we developed the tenets about being owned by the individual but shaped by the organization, so that we were responsible for delivering and supporting training that aided in our mission. So although it would be nice to have everyone completely skilled up in Dreamweaver, I mean, I say that, it probably wouldn't be all that useful, but it's not perhaps something that the library would invest in, okay? So it's owned by the individual but shaped by the organization. And finally, it reflects current needs and future goals. Okay? And we're really explicit about it. Like, this is what we need right now. This is where we want to be. This is going to enable you to start where you are right now and get where you want to be. All right? Okay, so with that in mind, we started looking at, oh gosh, 2 minutes of questions. So we started looking at the thing we call the learning cycle. So first we assess, which is that holistic, hopefully multimodal, different ways to baseline or to think about where you are. Then we address. That's the institution's responsibility. We find a way to address the issues that have been raised, okay? But then we evaluate. This goes back to the individual on one level. Not only did you like it, which is always, it's a good question, but a very surface one, but have you used it in your work? When have you used it in your work? Have you disseminated it? When have you disseminated it? Who else is using it? Can you kind of, for us, map out the impact the training has had on you and on those around you? Okay? And then finally, we embed it. There is an expectation that if you take training, we will see it in evidence somewhere. Even if it's just, you've written a blog post about it and it's clearly changed the way you think about something. Okay? You don't have to demonstrate you're a whiz at Excel all of a sudden in order to show that you've embedded the work. But you do need to then, after you've embedded it, reassess, okay? Readdress, reevaluate, and then you keep going. And what it does is it just keeps the cycle going, but at no one point does anyone say, this is who you are, this is what you must do. But it also doesn't necessarily let the individual craft something that we didn't have the resource to support. And then finally, we've created a tool. I don't have a screenshot of it because we just totally changed the way it looks. But basically what it does is it asks you to select what it is you've addressed. Okay, so this is basically a form, but it's on top of a UI that we're reshaping after some piloting. So it's asked you to select what you've addressed, both the capability or area you think you're looking at, and also whether it was face-to-face, online, blended, whether it was informal or formal, okay, things like that. It asks you to reflect on what you've learned. Okay, so you haven't learned until you've thought, you haven't thought until you've reflected, okay, you haven't really done anything with it until you've at least started thinking about it. So to get any kind of credit, okay, you have to reflect. This is how you verify that you've done training for us. Finally, we ask you to evaluate it, okay, so did it go well, all of the general questions. But then what we've added in is a return. every time you come, after the third or fourth time, we're about to do questions, it says, given about 6 months ago you did this, is it still affecting you? Has it changed anything? Would you like to add anything to your reflections? Because there's something called elaboration and space retrieval. There are 2 learning strategies that show the most significant effect on people. And by adding that in, we've embedded them into our verification tool. Now it's question time. And I realize I've given you a lot to think about. So I guess you could raise your hand and say, keep talking about X, and pose it as a question. Or yes.
It's really interesting.
Thank you.
And I'm really interested to know the stage where you evaluated.
Yeah.
How were you measuring the performance of the training, or how successful or otherwise it was?
So there's a couple different ways we ask. So one of the measurements is manager snapshot. So that not individually, but managers are asked, training over the years been X in your team. You know, have you seen something happen? The second thing is within the tool, it says, first of all, did it meet your needs? Second of all, how have you changed it? So it's how you answer those sort of questions. But finally, we're putting a lot of weight behind this return question. So we won't consider something a success unless it shows impact 6 months or more after the fact. So if there are a lot of people who do a huge thing and it's very expensive and or whatever the metrics are, but it's not actually been embedded into the culture of the library, either we need to do more work in that area or we need to change the way that training happened. So that's going to be one of our key metrics. But we're trying again to kind of triangulate, like, was it fit for purpose in the moment? Is it worked in terms of you and your role? And then finally, sort of management perspective / long-term impact. Yes. Yes.
But I would argue that actually for some roles, particularly, where you need people to do stuff, they need to do it in a particular way.
Yes.
They need to have particular skills in order to be able to do that. And so I just wonder how you kind of marry those 2 things, because sometimes...
I think, to be fair, it's as semantically nitpicky as saying develop instead of change. So if I went up to someone and I went, you have to change the way you do this, that means they have to stop what they're doing and do something totally different. If I said, you need to develop the way you're approaching answering questions when students ring you up, please don't hang up and tell them to come into the library. True story. Answer. That's different. It's a different approach. It assumes that their prior knowledge and understanding can be incorporated into whatever it is that needs to happen next. It's also only fair because but we're frequently enough changing our systems that acting as if it's the staff's problem is a bit unfair, I think, on staff. If we change the system, it's our problem to help them develop. If we need a cultural change, again, it's ours, and then they also have to be an active, and they have to have agency to participate. But it's not necessarily about change, it is about development.
So you mentioned an interesting word there, which is culture.
Yes.
And I just wonder how you're selling that, because presumably it is a cultural thing.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Kind of how that fits in with the kind of vision of the library.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work in the library around what we call our 5 ways of working, and in fact, since Jan's been in post, it's been a while now, it might be almost 10 years, she's never allowed to leave. We've really come on incredibly in terms of how we approach things, but one of the main things we did is the way we piloted this is we tried to address the top concern, and one of the top concerns was, I don't want my manager to look at my scores. There's a protective nature in development, so they don't. You're expected to discuss your development, but you own, so we had everyone participate in the pilot for the Just Digital Capabilities tool, mostly because they could, but that doesn't get sent to your manager. Nobody owns that except you. So you take that, and the discussion is where the important things happen. So we allow for that private, until people are comfortable with saying what they're developing and where they're learning, we allow for that private kind of space. It also gives people a better place to reflect. It's the difference between almost a noisy room where everyone's staring at you and a quiet place. And a lot of librarians, not a librarian, a lot of librarians went into the profession because they do like quiet, thoughtful working places. And that has just completely changed. So we're trying to give people space for that preference within the demands of the profession, which is very different now.
Is there one more?
There is one more.
That'll be the final one.
Okay, thank you. There you go. Yes.
You said you were working with people who maybe only have 1 hour, 2 hours a day,
Yeah.
up to full time.
Yeah.
But in reality, with someone with that level of commitment, how does it actually work? How do they
Yeah. So a lot of their responsibility for that would lie on their manager. So I can't affect all of the change all the time. Although I like just being loud and then hoping people have to listen. I do think that it's about us valuing the time. So if you're there for 2 hours, you get your half hour to do your stuff. And quite frankly, if that means we need to get more efficient at shelving, then we should get more efficient at shelving, because many people who shelve then go on to do other roles. We also employ some students on part-time casual basis. They're in there about 8 hours a week, and I successfully nagged until they were counted as part of the staff for this, because quite frankly, I'm happy to pay them. Again, so it's about, if we're not happy to support it within their role, then we're saying they're not important in this case, and maybe they shouldn't have to do it. But if we think they have to do it, then we have to give them the time. And that was the last question, but if you have more questions, I'll be here for most of the rest of the day. Then again, small children, so I have to race back up to Manchester. But I'm always on Twitter, always. In 2 in the morning when the 18-month-old is up, I am on Twitter. So if you ever had any questions or you want to come by or give me a ring or learn more about this, please do. Thank you for the extra time.